Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In God's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will return to bring you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. I go to prepare a place for you. Every building, like every person, has a story. And while no one person can know every story, sometimes by knowing a few of them, it can change the way that you see a place for good. And so today, on this day in which we break ground on our new outreach center, our endeavor to bring together our clothing, our food, our health care ministries all into one place. On this day in which we break ground to begin the renovation and the expansion of 1010 East Avenue. In other words, on this day in which we start a new chapter in the story that is 1010, maybe it makes sense to pause for a moment to look back at the story to date. And while it's so tempting for us to just jump to that moment in which that building came into our possession, May 16th, 1943, as I'm sure most of you knew, to do so would miss a really important part of the exposition, because you see, as it turns out, long before we ever became stewards of 1010 East Avenue, it had become known in this area as a place of and for the community. And so, like we do with any good story today, let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. In God's house, there are many rooms. Now, some will know that 1010 East Avenue was built in 1907. Some might even recognize that it was built in the English Tudor Revival style. Duh. But for those, what we may not recognize is the circumstances around which it was built. You see, Ruth Cowles Hart Bartlett was 43 when she had 1010 East Avenue built. A native of Rochester, she had grown up in the most privileged circles of Rochester. Her father was the co-founder of the Kimball Tobacco Company, and her mother, Isabel Hart, was one of the primary benefactors for Rochester General Hospital. There's even a nursing school there named after her, some might know. But you see, Ruth hadn't lived in Rochester for several years at the time in which she built it, decades in fact. Early in her life, just after she came of age, she married a young and well-known architect and quickly moved with him to start a new life out in Colorado Springs. And they were doing just fine for a while. That is, they had 2 young daughters and were building a house that he had designed. Only before they could move in, he died. We never know what a day is going to bring. She was there in Colorado Springs, and a few years later met another man that she married and had another daughter, her 3rd child, Agnes, when he died as well, which left her stranded across the country with 3 small children, no spouse, and no family to help. Maybe there are those out there today who've been there. So she came to Rochester. She moved back home And she picked that spot because it was just 2 doors down from her sister, and she knew she was going to need help. Not that she was helpless. There is a difference, as so many of us know. We all need help from time to time, don't we? Though not all of us are helpless. And Ruth was not. In fact, right away, she found a way to start investing in the community, perhaps digging into that spirit of volunteerism that her mother had engendered in her. She began right away to find a way to share of herself. She perhaps knew what it takes some of us so long to figure out, that sometimes the only way to deal with true and profound loss, to deal with that which has been taken away from us, is to find a way, as counterintuitive as it sounds, to give back. Sometimes we have to lose our life in order to save it. Maybe because of what had happened with her husbands, and maybe because the groundwork had already been laid by her mother, she began to invest in the medical community here in Rochester. She began to find a way to make sure that as many people as possible had health care in this area. And so she brought people to her home. She invited them to have meetings. The Twigs group that currently and still meets at Rochester General Hospital, that volunteer group, began in that building, in that place, and met there for years and years. It was there that hosted all the important community conversations that would be had around healthcare and about how to make sure that everybody was covered. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? And as so often happens, as we start to shed a little light into the darkness of this world, we start to see the light ourselves. For it was at one of those gatherings of medical professionals that she met a young physician with whom she would spend the rest of her life. It was from that place at 1010 East Avenue that a commitment to care for the health care needs of this community was born. But it didn't stay there. When World War I broke out, Ruth sent her 14-year-old daughter, Agnes, to France with her husband, where she stayed for 5 years setting up field hospitals to treat wounded soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Agnes became so ingrained and she found the experience so powerful that she came back and dedicated the rest of her life to caring for those who might need a little medical attention. In other words, what began at 1010 couldn't have stayed at 1010. It was a home for the community, and then it kept sharing from there. Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. By the time Asbury first bought 1010 East Avenue for $18,000, including the back taxes, it had fallen into a state of disrepair. Ruth had gotten too old to be able to take care of it and had moved into a home in Brighton. And Agnes had moved away to Washington, D.C., where she continued to advocate for the basic needs of all. And so we took over with the idea that we would tear it down along with the mansion that once sat in this very spot, the spot that some of us now sit in today. See, the minister at the time, the Reverend Weldon Crosland, had big plans. You know those senior ministers. He had plans for a much larger church than even the one that is currently here, at a steeple that was twice as high, and a plant that was much, much bigger, that included 2 bowling alleys, which, in case you're wondering, is exactly 2 more than we have today. They were planning to raise 1010, but at the last minute they decided to themselves, well, you know what, maybe this home would still have some value as a community house. Little did they know. Almost immediately it became the favorite haunt for many of the young people within our congregation. They would come on the weekends and there would be dances that would be hosted there, square dances. Weldon Crosland just asked that they keep the shades closed so as to not cause a scandal. It was, of course, quite a big deal, given that 70 years prior, we have an entire book of sermons from the senior minister at the time railing against what he thought was the greatest scourge in Rochester, dancing. He warned for those who were listening that it would not take long for a square dance to round off into a waltz. And then where would we find ourselves? Oh, we got trouble. But the truth is, friends, those dances, the gatherings of young people there and other people became a bonding agent for this community. It became a way that Asbury first came together, and it was the place where so many met the people that they loved. The longest term member of this congregation, Mason Fitch, who at 96 has been a member of this congregation his entire life, met his wife Gin at one of those dances. They found a way to connect with one another. It was in that building that the lifeblood of this congregation kept pumping for the last 70 years. Those small groups that grew into larger groups, those Sunday school classes that began meeting, so many of them, when some of the wives were home while their husbands were away at World War II, and then just kept meeting together over and over throughout the years to raise children together, and then their grandchildren, and to find a way to share life with one another. That happened in that building next door. It has been a place where countless meetings have happened, lectures have happened, and every once in a while, a good object lesson. Don Sherman shared the story of when Peggy Elliott was attempting to raise awareness for the need to replace the roof by pouring water over Larry's head. We would have liked to have seen that. It has hosted countless weddings and funerals. It has been the place where parents met their adopted children for the first time. Emily and I had our wedding reception in that building. Maybe you did too. In other words, it has been a place for community for as long as we've had it, though not just for us. Some will remember that the storehouse began in a closet in 1010, when in 1965 a man came to the church looking for a pair of pants, and Miss Dolly Rugg, a small woman with a big personality and an even bigger heart, thought if one person needs a pair of pants, certainly others do as well. And so she pulled together a group of women, noticing a theme, to begin to collect donations from people first in the church and then, of course, from people throughout the town. They commandeered a closet and began inviting people in to come and pick out what they'd like in a humanizing and dignifying way, to come and find what it is that you would like to wear. And what began there in 1965, that is 56 years ago, has grown. And before the pandemic, we were serving 6,000 families a year. 6,000 families a year who were in need of clothing and basic home goods so that they could come and find what it is that they need. For I was naked and you gave me something to wear. Of course, though, it was not just the storehouse that was there. It was also, over the years, provided shelter from the storm through our RAIN program. And of course, who could forget the Dining and Caring Center? Some will remember that the Dining and Caring Center began when Bill Lisi heard a charge from the Reverend Margie Mason about what we might do to make a difference within Rochester. And so what began on one cold January morning with an A-frame sign and a few sandwiches grew from there January 17th, 1993, to an entity that before the pandemic was serving more than 35,000 meals a year to area homeless and underfed, that added showers and laundry and hair care in that place. Do you see 1010 East Avenue from the very beginning of its inception has been a place for and of the community. And now is no different, though if we're honest, we recognize that a new chapter is coming, that the page is turning onto something brand new. If we're really honest, we know that it has not been as utilized as it could be in the last several years. For the last decade or so, for too often, it has sat too empty. But to whom much is given, friends, much is expected, and it is time to turn the page into a new chapter, to do something new with that space and to see where God will take it from here. To remember, in God's house, there are many rooms. Friends, this has always been a place for the community, but it's time to expand our vision. No longer can it just be for people who look like us or think like us or smell like us or vote like us or believe like us. Now it has to be for all. A visceral, tangible reminder of what has been true since the very beginning of our faith, that in God's house, there are many rooms. Friends, this can be and will be a beacon of hope for this community. In other words, our prayer is that after 57 years of ownership, it is time for it to hand over to someone new. That is, it will take likely a year or so to be done, but our prayer is that by the end of this, we will no longer be the owners, though we may be legally. But instead, it will be a building there for the community. It will be of and for the community, that beacon of hope, that light for the world that keeps shining and won't let any darkness overwhelm it. Friends, the church needs to keep shining its light. The truth is, too often Christians, too often people of faith have been on the wrong side of history. Too often the stories that we tell are not the ones that are fundamental to our faith. Look at this week in Kenosha. How many people were standing outside with their Bibles, confusing the Second Amendment with the Second Commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. But you do not love your neighbor by shooting them. No, it is time to change the story. For too long, Christians have stood on the wrong side of history. They've stood up for white supremacy instead of against it. Too often, we have persecuted members of the LGBTQ community instead of embracing them. For too long, we have turned our backs on the impoverished while we found ways to gain. Now it ends. The only way to change the story is by changing ourselves. The only way to make this world any better is by changing ourselves. The only way to make a lasting difference in this world is one relationship at a time. It begins today. Friends, now is time for a new story. Where it will go, we do not know. But it will be something where God is present every step of the way, and we will continue to listen to find our way within it. Do you see? This is Thanksgiving week. And so many of us will gather around our tables this week and give thanks to God for all with which we have been blessed. But we cannot do that without pausing at least once to remember all of those who don't have a meal to share or people to share it with. And to remember that when Christ said, "I will come again, so that where I am, there you may be also," he was asking us as the body of Christ to make a place for others in this world. In God's house, there are many rooms. And so, if you are hungry, this is a place for you. If you are thirsty, this is a place for you. If you are in need of health care or dental care or just someone to care, this is a place for you. Friends, we are turning the page on a new chapter in our lives. It is going to be one great story. What it will be, we do not know. But we will get to write it together. By God's grace, let us not forget that all are here, all are welcome, and all are a part of this story. This is a place for you. Amen.